My name is Melissa Dalton. I'm a senior fellow and the deputy director of the International Security Program here at CSIS. Today, we'll be having a conversation about assessing risk in the 21st century. Today's panel is conducted in partnership with the U.S. Army War College. We're pleased to do this a second year with U.S. Army War College as they launch forward their latest report on this topic of assessing risk in the 21st century, looking at DoD at the enterprise level and how it should be developing a framework for risk. With the U.S. Defense Strategy Review underway, Department of Defense leaders must consider how to adapt the framework for assessing risk to reflect a security environment marked by persistent and disruptive change. Today's conversation brings together a range of viewpoints from policy, planning, operations, and budgeting to unpack what it means to look at strategic and military risk. And we're joined by a distinguished group of experts whose experience will be self-evident in terms of the different viewpoints that they can bring to bear on the topic. I also want to note at the outset that in the unlikely event of an emergency incident here at CSIS, I will be your designated security lead and will provide some directions on how to proceed should we need to move forward with that. I'd like to introduce our panelists. At the far end, we have Ms. Christine Wormuth, who is the newly appointed director of the Adrienne Arsh Center for Resilience at the Atlantic Council, and of course, a CSIS alumna. Christine served as the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy from 2014 to 2016. Previously, Christine was Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Strategy, Plans, and Forces, and led the 2014 Quadrennial Defense Review process. She has also served as Special Assistant to the President and Senior Director for Defense at the National Security Council from 2010 to 2012, and as Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Homeland Defense and the Americas. We're also joined by Dr. Tom Mencken, who is the President and CEO of the Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessments. He is a senior research professor at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies and has served for over 20 years as an officer in the U.S. Navy Reserve. Tom served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Policy Planning from 2006 to 2009, where he helped craft the 2006 Quadrennial Defense Review and 2008 National Defense Strategy. He has served on the staff of the 2014 National Defense Panel and the 2010 Quadrennial Defense Review Independent Panel. To my immediate right, we are joined by CSIS's own Mark Kansian, who's a senior advisor with our International Security Program. Mark joined CSIS from the Office of Management and Budget, where he served as Chief of the Force Structure and Investment Division, working on DoD budget strategy, war funding, and procurement programs. Mark previously worked on force structure and acquisition issues in the Office of the Secretary of Defense and ran research and executive programs at Harvard University's Kennedy School. He has also spent 3 decades, in the U.S. Marine Corps. To his right, we are joined by Mackenzie Eaglin, who is a resident fellow in the Marilyn Ware Center for Security Studies at the American Enterprise Institute. Mackenzie has worked on defense issues in the House of Representatives and Senate, as well as at the Office of Secretary of Defense and on the Joint Staff. Mackenzie previously served as a staff member of the National Defense Panel and as a staff member for the 2010 Quadrennial Defense Review Independent Panel. And of course, finally, Mr. Nathan Freer, who is an associate professor of national security studies with the U.S. Army War College's Strategic Studies Institute and a senior non-resident associate here at CSIS. Nate completed a 20-year career in the U.S. Army, with his last military assignment as Director for National Security Affairs at the Strategic Studies Institute. Nate is a veteran of numerous strategy development and planning efforts at the Department of the Army, Office of the Secretary of Defense, and 2 senior military staffs in Iraq. Nate will also today be sharing some of the findings from his forthcoming report for the U.S. Army War College on assessing risk at the enterprise level at DoD. So with that, quite a considerable panel to bring to bear on today's fairly wonky discussion on risk. It's a devoted crowd. So to kick things off, I'd like to ask each of the panelists, starting with Christine, and we'll work our way down, to broadly talk about what is your view of how DoD approaches risk? How is it identified, assessed, and communicated currently in the department? And Christine, if you could kick things off.
Sure. I thought I was going to be bad in cleanup, so I'm happy to have the opportunity to kick things off. And I think, I'm excited to hear what other folks have to say, because we definitely have a lot of QDR veterans and strategic review veterans, so this will be, I think, very interesting. My sense is, first of all, how the department thinks about risk, varies from administration to administration, from team to team. It tends to be, a framework, a process that gets reinvented every few years. And I think on the one hand, there's a lot of continuity in terms of how risk is identified and assessed. A lot of the challenges the department is facing, particularly in terms of sort of the broader security environment, the potential for different contingencies around the world, those are things that the senior leadership of the department is very familiar with. And I think to some extent, it's a cumulative process in that very few people are coming into the process with no kind of baseline sense of what the risks are. So I think some of it is it becomes kind of cumulative. I also think it's very much formed at the senior leader level, and it's very much kind of a qualitative assessment. Certainly there are aspects, I think, of risk in the department that have more quantitative assessments and more analytic pieces that go into it. But in my experience, how the department really thinks about risk, and in terms of how it tries to factor risk into its decision-making process, that is a very qualitative judgment that's informed, again, by the experiences of the senior leaders who are around the table. I thought I would try to, in my mind, I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the challenges I think that the department faces in terms of thinking about risk and handling risk at the enterprise level, because I think it is something the department continuously struggles with, both in terms of its own assessment of what risk is, how it communicates that risk to the entire DoD enterprise, and then more broadly to external audiences, whether it's Congress or friends and allies or frankly adversaries, and then how it uses that assessment of risk to try to adapt its processes and make decisions and change budgets and things like that. There are a lot of challenges around that, and I wanted to talk about sort of 4 of them that I see. One of the biggest challenges in my mind for the department looking at risk at the enterprise level is what I call the tyranny of the present. There tends to be a heavy focus on present day risks, things that you can see in front of you that are already happening, scenarios like North Korea, like the Middle East, like the war on terrorism. And so I think when the department thinks about risk, it tends to weight the present and the current very heavily, often at the expense of future risk, which is obviously by definition much harder to see, but is probably more important in terms of trying to plan ahead and, again, to try to make decisions in terms of budgets and what kinds of capabilities you use. So I think trying to frame risk in a way that gives the future a seat at the table is very important. And I think it was the 1997 QDR, I'm not entirely sure, but the 97 QDR had a risk framework that I thought was frankly one of the best ones I've seen kind of in the last 20 years. And it framed risk in 4 different dimensions. There was operational risk, which is essentially present day risk, future risk, which was again thinking about the future security environment, future potential contingencies, force management risk, which was looking at the actual, things like readiness, things like recruiting and retention, how we're using the military, and then institutional risk, which was actually trying to give the department an opportunity to look at things like how are we doing in terms of reforming our processes? How is acquisition, working or not working? What do we need in terms of things like BRAC? And I think there was a lot of goodness, I think, to that framework, but in particular, it created an opportunity for senior leaders to think actively about trade-offs between present-day risk and future risk. A second challenge I see is what I call the iceberg problem, which is, you can see the tip of the iceberg is visible above the waterline, but there's a whole bigger thing underneath the water that people don't see. And again, there I would say risk assessments, in my experience, tend to emphasize the the present, the contingencies, the things you can see around the world, and don't look very much at things like force structure, force management, institutional risk, which I think are very significant things and can have major impacts on our ability to respond effectively to contingencies. And so trying to think about risk in a way that actively gives you the opportunity to think about the bottom part of the iceberg, I think is very important, and that's something I think that more recently we have not done very effectively. A third challenge that I have seen is the difficulties around communicating risk effectively. Again, both inside of the department, but then also to external audiences. I don't think that there's a one-size-fits-all solution for how to communicate risk or think about risk. Again, you can frame it in many different ways, and I think there are different ways that you can do it effectively. But you do have to have some sort of framework, some sort of lexicon for risk. And I think the entire building, certainly the senior leadership team, the civilian leadership, the uniformed leadership, the combatant commands, need to be speaking the same language and be all on one page. And that's something that we have not always excelled at. Our ability to communicate to Congress, to, again, friends and allies, is not helped when you have service secretaries going up and talking about risk in one way, and then you have combatant commanders and doing their annual posture hearings and talking about it another way, or emphasizing one thing over here and a different thing over there. The message can very easily get lost. So I think it's important for the department to find ways to get the leadership team all on one page. And I found it, something I did find effective in the last 8 years was the secretary has something called the Senior Leader Council, the SLIC, which is an opportunity to bring the whole leadership team and the combatant commands together, which the secretary generally hosts about 4 times a year with the chairman. That venue is a great place, frankly, for the leadership of the department to debate what the risks are and how to think about them and how to talk about them and to get everyone all on the same page. And I think doing that face-to-face is very important. It's fine and good to sort of do the QDR process and to do, staff the draft document through the 2-star level, the 3-star level, the 4-star level. But having an actual debate and a face-to-face dialogue, I think, is very important and increases the potential for the leadership to buy into how to talk about risk. So I think that's something that's worked well, and I hope the new team continues to do that. Another challenge around risk is how to talk, recognizing that you are talking externally in an unclassified way to friends and enemies. And then also, you need to be able to speak frankly amongst yourselves inside the building. That can be challenging because obviously, you may want to have an honest conversation amongst yourselves about what risk is. And on the one hand, you want to be clear about that with Congress, particularly when it comes to making resourcing arguments, but you may not want to be quite as clear about risk to your adversaries. So navigating and sort of threading that needle is a challenge I think that every team struggles with. The last challenge I would just talk about is the difficulty around translating a risk assessment process and your core views about risk into the processes in the department that actually move the needle and turn the dial. The budget process, the thinking about readiness, making decisions about reforms. In my experience, we have had trouble translating judgments we make about risk into those other very important processes. Part of that, I think, is challenges the department has, about, again, it tends to be a status quo-oriented institution, and change is hard, and it's a cruise ship, and it's hard to navigate. But frankly, also some of it are constraints that are put on it externally, outside of the department. Congress in particular, it can be very difficult. There are a lot of things DoD needs to be able to do that require congressional permission, things like BRAC, obviously decisions about what kinds of weapon systems we're going to invest in. And so, the whole point of thinking about risk and assessing risk is arguably using those judgments to inform your actions and your investments. And it's often a challenge, I think, to be able to do that effectively. So that's something I also would encourage the new team to think about, which is how do you create a tie between any risk assessment process you have and set of judgments and then feeding it into the real processes that make changes in the department. So I'll just stop there.
Really helpful overview. Thank you, Christine. Tom?
Great. Thank you. Given the time, I really have three points to make, and the first one may sound incongruous, may sound strange, but my first point is that as a country and as a department, we've grown fundamentally unused to thinking seriously about risk. Now again, that may sound strange because here we are arrayed in front of you on a panel talking about risk, and the department has all sorts of processes and bureaucracies associated with risk. But fundamentally, for the past quarter century, we as a country, as a department, have really stopped thinking seriously about risk. I would date the beginning of that period really to the 1991 Gulf War, the outcome of the Gulf War. I think we went into the 1991 Gulf War thinking very seriously about risk, even in ways that today seem absurd, where you could have two faculty members, no offense, Nate, of the Army War College write, that we should think seriously about whether we're ready for war with Iraq. In our view, we are not. And that was a direct quote. The U.S. Army wasn't ready to face Iraq in 1991. But the outcome was very different. And I think all the way stretching to today, we have grown unused to thinking about serious risks. And as a result, we have a system that is in many ways risk averse, and that thinks about problems in dichotomous ways. Either we do very little to nothing, or we risk full-fledged war. So whether it's standing up to creeping Chinese aggression in the South China Sea, we do sort of very little because we don't really want to accept risk, or we worry about a full-fledged war. Or whether it's standing up to Russian aggression in Ukraine, we do very little because the alternative, as so it's posed, is full-fledged war. So we've become risk averse. We have a dichotomous view of risk, and then we've lived under the illusion. I think it has been an illusion for a number of years that we can just buy down risk. So so to the extent that we identify risks, we then try to buy them down rather than managing them or accepting them or trying to balance them. So that's point number one. Point two is to the extent that we do as a department think about risk, we have a biased and astrategic approach. It is an approach that is focused on our vulnerabilities and our adversaries' capabilities, which is certainly one part of the equation, but not on the equally important part of the equation, which is our capabilities and our adversaries' vulnerabilities, right? I mean, real strategy is about figuring out how to exploit your strengths and leverage them against an adversary's weaknesses while taking into account your adversary's ability to do damage to you. Our system, for a number of reasons that are understandable, but shouldn't be determinative, is really biased in the focusing on our weaknesses. And again, that's led to, in my view, a system that privileges risk over opportunity. And then third, I would agree with Christine that we tend to overvalue institutional, kind of organizational risk over the operational and strategic. And there I would cite no greater authority than Bob Woodward and his account of the tank session that sort of led to the surge in Iraq in late 2006, where President Bush, again in Woodward's telling, made the case for the surge, and then Chief of Staff of the Army said, "Well, but wait, if you send more troops to Iraq, you might break the Army." And the President replied, again in Woodward's telling, "Yeah, but wouldn't losing a war also do bad things for the Army?" 11 years on, I don't know that things have fundamentally changed in terms of that privileging of institutional risk over operational and strategic risk. So with those thoughts as preface, hopefully there's enough there that's interesting and controversial that we can have a good discussion going forward. Thanks.
Much to unpack there. Thank you so much, Nate.
Yeah, so thank you very much. First, let me just start off by thanking CSIS. It's always great to be back here, back home with friends and colleagues that I've spent a lot of time with over the years. And I also, on behalf of the War College, would like to thank CSIS for maintaining what I think has been a very important partnership over the last few years on some of the more important work we've been doing. So I'm going to make a couple of points and hopefully briefly make a couple of points on the work we recently did, just to kind of throw out our angle on it. Now, the one thing I'll say is, and we had talked beforehand, some of this is going to sound a little bit like a broken record, because I think that anybody who actually thinks deeply about this problem, and I think everybody at this table has at some point thought very deeply about this problem. It basically identifies the same challenges that are associated with looking at an enterprise the size of DoD and focusing it in the right way on the concept of risk. And so, having said that, let me just give you a small history lesson of Nate Fryer over the last 2 years. I did 2 reports in the last 2 years, or I, with a team of great War College faculty and students, did 2 reports over the last 2 years. The first on gray zone challenges, focused on gray zone challenges, and the second now on risk and enterprise level risk in DoD. And it's not an accident. It's not an accident that the first report on gray zone challenges is titled Outplayed, and the second report that is soon to be published, and you have the exum sitting out on the table, is titled At Our Own Peril. They frankly walk hand in hand with one another, and it is in many ways for the very reasons that were laid out so eloquently by Christine and Tom. We got very used to being able to actually impose our will worldwide at the end of the Cold War. We were a global power that could generate local superiority. We are now still a global power that has difficulty and challenges generating military advantage or superiority locally in a number of places around the world. And there's a variety of reasons behind that. In our report, we call this we call this the post-primacy period, which has brought a lot of people, caused a lot of angst in some of the folks that we've briefed on this, but we couldn't put it in stark terms, I should say, largely because we wanted to say, wake up, right? Get the way you look at risk right, and understand that right now you are actually being outplayed in things that you used to fundamentally be very good at. One of the participants in our study started our study effort out when we had our first expert working group, which should be familiar to all my CSIS colleagues. Started the actual working group out by saying, look, why this is important is because we could lose, right? And I would actually say that not only could we lose, right, but there might be places right now that we're actually losing. So getting this actually, getting the concept of risk right, and being able to look at it, from now over time and at multiple levels of analysis, and being able to have an informed senior leader discussion on risk in the department is perhaps the most important thing that could come out of the strategic review that's currently ongoing inside the department. So we found 3 things, right? And I'm going to be a little bit of repeat a couple things, but I think that these are very important to emphasize. In looking at enterprise level risk in the department, we found number 1, that is excessively focused on near-term threats and challenges. That's number 1. Number 2, risk assessment lacks a meaningful connection back to enduring defense objectives. It spends a lot of time looking at threats. It does not spend a lot of time looking at what is it exactly we're trying to do with the defense instrument going forward and securing U.S. interests going forward with the defense instrument. And finally, and I think most importantly, actually, in this concept of an environment defined by disruptive change, I think this is actually the most important takeaway message that we have in the report itself, is that it has proven to be an insufficient catalyst for the kind of essential post-primacy defense innovation and adaptation that needs to occur and needs to start occurring immediately. The Department of Defense was created in, I believe, 1947, and do I have that right? The National Security Act of 1947. It was created in the first half of the 20th century. It is largely carrying many of the conventions and biases from that period all the way into, as we headed into the first half of the 21st century. And as a result of that, we are not necessarily focusing either our strategy or our risk processes sufficiently on the concept of adaptation in an environment that's persistently changing. So look, I'm going to talk about the four. We think risk should actually hinge on four key principles: risk assessment in the department, diversity, dynamism, persistent dialogue, and adaptation. Okay, I'm going to talk about those principles very quickly, and I'm going to turn it over to my able panel mates. What do we mean by diversity? Okay, we have to exercise a little bit. We have to, instead of actually finding the single pacing item that we want to. In the contemporary environment, you're not going to have just the one pacing item that's going to save you from your interest being at in fundamental peril. So there has to be a diversity in the types of hazards that you assess and the types of defense responses associated with those hazards. The days where we could measure piles of iron against one another by itself and say we got a bigger pile of iron than the other guy has are gone. The environment we are, under persistent assault from both purposeful challenges, adversaries who have hostile designs against the United States, and contextual challenges, environmental problems that just generate spontaneously based on sort of the collapse of effective political authority in certain regions of the world, et cetera. And we have to actually have a risk process that recognizes that. As far as dynamism is concerned, the second principle, look, you have to be dynamic in the way you look at the world. The world is changing. Not only are our hazards changing, but our capability to actually contend with those hazards is changing. We're getting better at it in some cases. We're being more challenged at it in some cases. And as a result of that, you have to, your risk assessment process by itself, and I would also argue, frankly, your strategy development process has to be necessarily dynamic as well. Persistent dialogue gets to, I think, what Christine was talking about. And this is a little bit of a nod to Mike Mazer at RAND, who actually started talking about this in like 2014, 2015, something like that. But look, risk assessment is really about a dialogue. It's not about the thing that you put up on the shelf at the end of a process, right? It's about senior leadership actually having a common currency, which is the word we use for a common language in the report, having a common currency as it relates to risk, talking in that common currency amongst one another, and making risk-informed trades at the strategic, at the operational strategic level. And where that resides and how that process unfolds, that may be, more formal or less formal to certain administrations, but the process of persistent dialogue has to underwrite the entire enterprise. And then finally, adaptation. Again, look, this is one thing we heard from top to bottom. We went out, we talked to combatant commands, we talked to the services, we talked to senior leadership on the civilian side of the department, talked to senior leadership on the military side of the department. Risk assessment has to have a point, right? The point has to be adaptation. It has to be adapting the institution to the circumstances that it finds itself in, and that point cannot be just reminding yourself of your operational vulnerabilities, which is essentially what we do in the process right now. So look, it has to have a point. Now, 3 final points I'm going to make, and then I'm turning over. I think that This came very, very late in the process, but we realized that there's confused risk ownership inside DoD. So we think that responsibility, authority, and ownership of the risk, the concept of risk at the enterprise level has to be aligned and has to be unified. And there's only one person that's eligible in that regard, and that's the Secretary of Defense. So as they go through the strategy review process, we really do emphasize that the Secretary take a hard look at how, from an enterprise perspective, they are looking at and talking about risk. Because he or she will be, over time, the sole sort of point where all of those things collide: responsibility, authority, and ownership for risk. Second, risk has to be a culture, right? And by that I mean, I think actually Tom's point was really good. Like, not everything is like, because you're talking about risk doesn't mean you're afraid of everything. It means that you're actually looking at the challenges. You're sufficiently looking at the challenges you face and actually trying to mitigate, transfer, accept, et cetera, the risks that you see. So it has to be a culture, and it has to be persistent in your strategy development process. And then finally, let me just close with this idea of risk as an instrument of adaptation. If your risk assessment process does not have a point, it is not worth the effort. With that, I'll turn over.
Great, thanks, Nate. Mackenzie. Good, thanks, Melissa, for having the conversation, and Nate for your awesome work with your team on this report, because I've enjoyed working on it with you, and I think you're right. If you're recommending it to anyone new in the audience, they should read the Gray Zone report first, and then pick this up, put it on their nightstand second, because they're both complementary and really important. Three brilliant colleagues who've talked already enough. So I'm going to talk quickly about the first challenge I see with risk is that yet in 30 minutes into our panel, in my mind, we haven't defined it specifically yet for defense, but I'm going to get to a bigger point. If I'm going to define it, if I'm the chairman, and I think this is one way he would look at it, and there's probably many other pieces of the definition, which I'm going to open up to the panel to pile on. But if I were actually going to put it in the Merriam-Webster, I would say risk, defense, enterprise-wide risk is, well, Christine did a good job with the four, but I'm talking in terms of operational specifically here. It's a longer time to complete the mission, longer time to get to the end zone, which hopefully is winning, victory, higher number of killed or wounded in action as a result of whatever, and outright mission failure. Those to me are the three components of defense risk that actually comprise the definition. And there are risks underneath it. Christine outlined the four reasons that can contribute to all of those things happening. The organization is a Soviet-style management acquisition system, right, which it is, or whatever, lack of reform, lack of this, lack of that. Capability, capacity, readiness, all volunteer force, cracks. There's a lot of things that can contribute to those three outcomes, but to me that's the definition. But then why would those occur? Why would we be struggling, I think, with risk on an enterprise level for all of the reasons Tom, Nate, and Christine outlined? Because there's risk in U.S. foreign policy and grand strategy. So there's a lack of strategic clarity in our foreign policy. And it's been that way since, yep, you guessed it, 1991, as it's already been said. And so when you have a lack of clarity, confusion reigns. And foreign policy is the parent, defense policy is the child. So if there's confusion in foreign policy, there's inevitably chaos in defense planning and policy, which then leads to increased risk. And again, for reasons that have already been laid out here. After World War II, the United States had an active risk mitigation strategy as part of our foreign policy. And that strategy accidentally, partly, birthed the liberal international order that is now one of our four fundamental core national interests to defend. But that risk mitigation strategy was designed to get at some of what Tom was eloquently talking about, which was, there used to be this old saying that superpowers don't fight small wars, but actually what we learned as a result was, nope, you really do just want to fight a bunch of small ones and never fight the big one. But I think we've completely lost that perception, like the telescope got turned around, partly because we're risk averse, Tom outlined some reasons why I take it a step farther. We're risk averse in warfare in the definition I use, right? So, the threat of one ship being harmed, one aircraft falling out of the sky because of an enemy, fire, one Mogadishu. I mean, our risk has now translated in the foreign policy chaos and confusion to the American public is now, or at least we perceive them to be, risk averse right alongside the defense enterprise. So when you have all this confusion in foreign policy about what purpose our power serves, and military power, of course, is the tip of the spear, but our power is all of the tools therein: soft power, humanitarian aid, foreign aid, intelligence, trade, alliances, military. If you don't know, if there's not clarity in both parties and at the White House about why do you have these tools? Why should they always be strong, whether in times of peace or war or something in between, like a hybrid gray zone something? And what are they supposed to do? Then of course they atrophy. And now risk again goes up as a result. And so I see this as not only a problem that's reigned since '91, unfortunately, we can get to this in the Q&A, I'm worried it's not getting any better. I mean, we can pick on this president, and I will, but it's not exclusive to him. It's a conversation, it's a hard, uncomfortable conversation like so many in Washington that few want to have. We don't want to have them on entitlements, that they're Ponzi scheme, trust fund, insolvent programs. We don't seem to want to have it on risk either in terms of active management and leadership in the world actually prevents those big wars. Yes, it may mean a lot of smaller little ones, but you got to be out there, you have to lead. And what does leading mean? You have to be forward. Those are hard things. Being forward is expensive. We want a nation built at home, both parties. There's a whole lot of layers and reasons behind why there's defense risk, because there's foreign policy risk. And there's foreign policy risk because there's a lack of clarity about not necessarily our interests, but again, why do we maintain strong standing tools of power and what is the purpose behind using them?
Great. That's really helpful context to kind of broaden the conversation. And I want us all to come back to the definition that McKinsey offered for comments. But let's turn to Mark next for opening thoughts.
Thanks. Well, let me make 3 points that build on some of the discussion that we've already had on the panel. The first is that there's very little public discussion about risk when you look at DoD's documents. For another study, we've gone through all of the QDRs, for example, to see how they describe a risk and do a risk assessment, and there's very little in there. And of course, behind the curtain, inside the department, in the classified areas, there's a much more robust discussion, but publicly there's very little. Sometimes you see discussions about levels of risk, high, medium, and low. When the department wants to get colorful, they go to red, yellow, green. But many people have criticized that because behind those judgments is some standard that is unstated. Further, the standards are skewed by the political and budget process. No area is ever low risk because the concern there is that if it's described as low risk, then that will be a bill payer for other demands. So really, it's just medium and high, and very different flavors of that. One of the approaches that we've come up with in some previous reports is to describe risk in policy terms, that is, as if-then statements. If the Navy cuts the carrier force to 10, then there will be 3-month gaps in the Indian Ocean. If the active Army gets small enough, then a contingency in Korea will have to rely on guard combat units, and that will delay the counteroffensive by 4 months. And putting these kind of risk judgments into if-then statements then might allow a discussion, as Christina had talked about. And there have been other proposals to do that. Nate and his group have come up with one mechanism. IDA has a different mechanism for assessing or beginning a conversation about risk. But the key thing there is to have that discussion at the highest levels and have it about specifics. Is it okay to have a gap in carrier coverage? Some people might argue yes. The Navy might point out that whenever there is a gap, the National Command Authority very often requires them to fill it. But you can have that discussion. When we talk about the future, we had some discussion there about whether our risk assessments are biased towards the present. And the irony there is that back in the 1980s, the department brought the COCOMs into the discussion about resources in order to give readiness more of a standing, because it was felt that the services biased the present for interest in the future, because they were building new systems and that they were therefore too focused on the future. So this is an area where the department's gone back and forth, and there's probably no perfect balance. I would say, though, that we have to be cautious when we start thinking about the future. And again, this is picking up on something Christine said. Thinking about the future is a lot of fun. I mean, speculating about warfare in 2030 or 2050 is very exciting. You can extrapolate. It's almost in the realm of fiction, and there are very few constraints. The problem is bringing that back and saying, okay, what do we need to do now to prepare for that future? Or in DoD terms, what do we need to do in the FIT-up, the 5-year plan, to prepare for that future? Because if the answer is nothing, then that's an interesting conversation, but you're not getting the job done. You're dodging the difficult issues. What you need to be talking about is, what do we need to put in the FIT-up? Now, it might be that we'll put some long-term R&D programs into the FIT-up and see how they play out, and that would be a perfectly reasonable thing to do. But there are a lot of things that that might happen in 2050, and if they do, or if we see them coming, we can, in 2030, do something about it, but we don't need to do it today. And I'm going to particularly pick on the Army in this regard, and I realize I have some of them right here in the second row. But the Army is looking out to 2050. And, again, very interesting, but there's very little that you would change today based on how you think the world in 2050 might be. Maybe some R&D programs. But I would say I don't think there's any force structure change you would make today based on what you thought 2050, because force structure can be changed relatively quickly, and by 2030 or 2040 you could probably make the force structure changes that you need. And just as a thought experiment, 2050 is about 35 years into the future. If you go back 35 years, the Soviet Union was still a real going concern. It's hard for many people in this room to remember those days, but that would be 1980, 1982-ish. The Soviet Union was not just viable, but was a real threat, and people thought it would go on forever. So we could never, and I can assure you, we never imagined today's world back then. So the idea that we can imagine 2050 from today, I think, is just asking a lot. And on that discouraging note, I'll turn things over to Melissa.
Great. Well, a lot laid out on the table to dig into. I do want to circle back to the definition that Mackenzie offered of risk, and you put it kind of in operational terms, but I'd be curious to draw out the panel's thought in terms of, can that be expanded upon, or can those be principled basis to building a larger definition of risk that applies at the multiple levels that Christine was describing at the beginning? And to recap, the way Mackenzie laid it out was a long time to complete the mission, higher numbers of killed in action and wounded, and outright mission failure. Mark, did you want to?
Well, I was just going to say that when you look at the risk literature, the classic definition is consequence times probability. That is, what is the consequence of failure in this area, and what is the probability that will occur? And the classic example here, again, is strategic nuclear warfare. The consequences are huge. The probability is very small, but because the consequences are so huge, even with a small probability, we are willing to invest a lot of resources. Conversely, there are things that happen every day, and we just learn to live with them.
So in our work, and actually this is sort of frankly an artifact of the work I've done for the last decade and a half, really. I really boil the concept of risk down to the likelihood of failure or prohibitive cost, right, as it relates to objectives. So some things we say we're going to do, we can't do, and some things we say we're going to do, but the cost associated with doing them is so excessive that we have to adapt what it is we want to accomplish. And I think using that basic rule, that's kind of how we proceeded, using that basic rule. Now we have a little more, sort of wonky way of talking about that concept as it applies to our risk construct, right, or our concepts for risk. But that's my basic rule.
Yeah, I mean, I basically agree. I think when I think about risk, I think about, your ability to achieve your objectives at an acceptable cost. And so different ways to manage risk include trying to buy it down by, buying greater capability, trimming back your objectives, and then also becoming, more cost accepting. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think Mackenzie's formulation is a good way to think about it. And actually, we tried to do just that in QDR 2014, which I'm the first person to say is not our finest QDR for a lot of different reasons. But we did try to spell out risk publicly in the document, particularly because the Budget Control Act and the whole sort of Damocles of sequestration was hanging over the department so much. We were really trying to use the QDR that cycle to make the case to the Congress as to why we needed more resources. And we explicitly did talk about risk, and we explicitly said, if sequestration happens and a war breaks out in a place like the Korean Peninsula, for example, we will take longer. We said the outcome of the mission is not in doubt. We will prevail, but it will take longer. We will have more casualties. It will be, as I think Secretary Mattis said, a catastrophic kind of event. So I think that's a good way to formulate it. I think one of the big challenges is thinking honestly about the probability. I mean, those things are all consequences: time, casualties, whether you can win or not. The challenge is assessing what is the probability of that, and that's sort of where the art piece comes in.
One thing that we did in the work that we did that may be novel, may not be novel, I don't know. But we spent so much time talking about likelihood and consequence and the concepts of likelihood and consequence that we actually reattacked that and said, is there a better way? Is there a better way to frame it? And it's where we came up, and there's folks from the team are out here, so if you want to jump up and tell me I'm all wet, by all means do so. But we opted for importance and urgency over likelihood and consequence. And the reason we did that is we thought, the concept of importance sort of married the concept of strength of interest, right? That you hear thrown around quite a bit with consequence, with, how bad will it be? And that urgency was really likelihood married to the need or pressure to act. Because sometimes there are things that, I think Mark said it, there are things you see coming down the road that the pressure to act is, I got to invest more money, or I have to build more forces, or I have to change the way I'm configured. Or there might be something right up in your face that the need or pressure act means I got to deploy forces now, I got to take care of the problem. But we found that, honestly, in the approach we took, we found that to be a better way to actually communicate those concepts, the likelihood and consequence concepts, but in a more holistic and fulsome way.
Tom, I wanted to go back to something that you said in your opening thoughts about how there's too much focus on weakness and not enough focus on strengths. And this relates to something that I've also thought about and talked to Nate about in the course of his study, is the need to look more at opportunities and not just threats and challenges. Could you unpack a little bit more what you meant by that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, look, the way our national security community is configured, and again for reasonable purposes, it's focused on preventing surprises and preventing bad people from doing bad things to us. In the intelligence world, It's a focus on indicators and warning, preventing surprise. In military planning, it's what prudent military planning. It's worst case. It's you don't want to be surprised. Again, that's completely understandable, but that's only one dimension of sound strategy. And I think by oftentimes focusing on bad things and exclusively on bad things that bad people can do to us, we sometimes ignore strategic opportunities that we have. And those are opportunities that arise from our ability to leverage our strengths against the weaknesses of our competitors. And so, again, our system is biased. I think many systems are biased. But in doing so, we leave on the table options that we may have to influence others. So there are others out there that are concerned about capabilities that we have, that are making investments to counter capabilities that we have that we don't really privilege because we're so focused on what others can do to us.
I want to push back on that a little bit. A little bit, because I don't think we do it. I agree with you that we don't do it as much as we should or as well as we could. But in my experience, we do think about the vulnerabilities of our adversaries or potential adversaries. And I'm thinking, I'm thinking very specifically about, particularly after Russia went into Crimea and into Ukraine, there was a very conscious effort to think about what are Russia's vulnerabilities, what might we exploit to try to harden ourselves, harden our NATO allies as targets. And I think there's, and that kicked off some very structured, real thinking about those kinds of things. I also would argue that we have tried to think about opportunities and leveraging our strengths, and particularly in looking at our relationship in Asia, I will just say that, I am concerned that much of this is being undone in the moment. But we definitely felt that our network of allies and partnerships in Asia, and frankly around the world, was one of our greatest strengths in foreign policy and in defense policy. And we thought in a very systematic way about how we could try to expand on that and build on that. And the agreement we signed with the Philippines to be able to put our folks back in different ways, what we did in Australia, what we've been trying to do in terms of, having a closer relationship to Vietnam, for example, are, I think, efforts to try to leverage our strengths. So it's not perhaps as well as, we're not optimizing it, but I don't think it's quite as bad as you're arguing.
So I guess the question I would ask, and I don't think we can answer it here at this table, is, okay, where's the investment stream associated with those efforts? And how does it rank in magnitude to the overall investment stream? So yeah, my argument is that it doesn't, I wasn't saying that it doesn't occur, I said that the system is biased, and it's biased in the other direction. And I think, again, this is a good research project, maybe for next year.
This time next year.
Follow the money.
Great. Any other thoughts on this thread? Great. Well, so we've I think laid some great groundwork conceptually for thinking about and defining risk. I want to turn a little bit to the structure and the current structure of how the department approaches risk. For enterprise risk assessment, it's typically been associated with and conducted by or led by the chairman, manifested in the chairman's risk assessment. And the SecDef, on the other hand, has typically been viewed as a risk consumer. There is a dialogue that occurs, as Christine talked about, through the SLIC mechanism and other fora. But does this current arrangement with the chairman really driving that risk discussion and kind of structure make sense in the contemporary security environment?
So just to kind of throw out where we landed on that issue. First of all, late in the process, we addressed this concept of ownership. It became an aha moment more than anything else. It was like we hadn't talked about it. We only talked about how the department should think about risk, but not who owns it. And then where we landed, I think, is that there is obviously, in the end, again, the alignment of authority, responsibility, and ownership has to be with the Secretary. I mean, I think that we are very strong in that regard. We also kept all the language that DoD continues to use, strategic and military risk, operational future challenges. We kept all that to eliminate any confusion. And I mean, I would argue that, when it comes to sort of the weight of responsibility, if you're looking at military risk, sort of at the operational level and the ability of the United States to execute discrete military missions, sort of the weight of responsibility starts with the chairman and works its way up. When you look at strategic risk, or what in our report we talked about strategic risk, we took a different tack really than the department has in the past in describing what strategic risk is. In our view, strategic risk was, is the azimuth of the department right? Is it actually pointed in the right direction at the right set of problems, or is it off slightly, or is it off, way off, right? We think that's the secretary's purview. I mean, he has to be the one that ultimately makes that decision and gives strategic direction to the department. But in the end, he owns the whole thing. And so I think he is a risk consumer from those risk assessments that bubble from the bottom up as it applies to operational risk, et cetera. But in the end, he has to make a decision, the choices that those risk conclusions, those risk recommendations, for lack of a better term, make. And so that's where we landed.
So it's a great point and a good question, because you'll get what you paid for your wonky panel discussion. Here we go, or continue. So right, we often associate it with the chairman because he does write the risk assessment, and the classified version is pretty good. It's actually pretty eye-opening when you can get your hands on it. But I think it's a remarkable step forward in thinking about ownership of risk, because as Christine, again, really laid out in the 97 QDRs, the types of risk. When I talked about risk, and actually it was more strategic military risk, but those types that we talked about in the QDR are in many cases causes of risk. So I'm talking about when I defined risk, I talk about the outcomes of high, low risk, or whatever. But those are all contributors. You could call them types of risk. I would call them contributors to risk, and actually in some cases. And so it's bigger than the chairman. It has to be about the secretary. It has to be a political appointee. It's purview, because the system that the bureaucracy operates within is inherently a political one. It's our government. It's the executive branch. And they have to get all their money from the legislative branch, a bunch of politicians. And they have to deal with the White House and the budget office at the White House, also all political appointees elected by the people, et cetera, et cetera. So this, as Christine found with the 14 QDR, I mean, you may not have said it explicitly, but what you guys were thinking about every other page was political risk, meaning our system, our political system, the inability to get consensus, the inability to get some sort of stability in terms of like 1 year forecasting for defense budgets, 2 year even. I mean, that would be amazing, right? Much less at FIDIP or beyond. How long is the CR? How long isn't it? Can, will the speaker have his job next month? These kinds of, who am I negotiating with as a secretary? Who do I go up, and who are the stakeholders? Fundamentally, that I need to say, we are lacking this clarity, and you guys can't get to yes, and it is a problem. The chiefs and the chairman can talk about it, but these are linked to political problems and challenges as well. So the owner has to be somebody with a political hat on, even if, like Jim Mattis, they don't want to think that they do, they do.
One thing, so this is somewhat related, but it's a point I really want to get across. There's one thing that really came out that I think is important for the department to change its perspective on, and that is that, for example, operational risk and future challenges risk are terminal ends on a continuum. They are not separate and distinct things, right? Like, that's one thing that that's always concerned me, is that you really don't, I mean, when I was talking to Vago outside, to tell you the truth, I said, what would the risk assessment on September 10th, 2001 have looked like? I mean, if future challenges risk is actually something that might come up tomorrow, and as a result of that, this idea of a persistent dialogue at the senior level about making choices and adaptation is so essential, because if you don't actually treat the time continuum as a continuum and the levels of analysis as a continuum, what you end up finding is there are huge gaps in where you are focusing your attention and looking for hazard. And as a result of those, you're setting yourself up for surprise, for shock, for all those things. So anyway, I wanted to make sure I got.
Thanks very much. A couple more questions from me, and then we will turn to the audience. A number of you have raised the very real tension between operational near-term assessments of risk and looking to the long-term future challenges, although there are challenges in itself, and looking to the future are far too out into the future. How can we reconcile that tension practically and balance it in such a way that the department can buy readiness over time?
Well, since I sort of raised that, I guess it's incumbent on me to make a statement. And I mean, one solution that the department has come up with is you have all the stakeholders at the table so that they all get their day in court. The COCOMs can make the argument for near-term readiness, whereas the services can make the argument for longer-term hedging for the future. And you also have the acquisition people there. And soon you will have an undersecretary for, I guess it's still R&E, but whose job is innovation, and one presumes that person will be the voice of long-term innovation and preparing for the future. So I think the department has hit on a viable approach, and then all the claimants will make their arguments. I was a little skeptical about looking at the future, but I think that my point there is to focus on what you need to do today. Not that you shouldn't think about the future, but if you just think about the future, it's easy to shirk the work. That is, to have this conversation about 2050 and not have the really difficult question about what do we do today? Does that mean that we should stop building aircraft carriers? Because that's the question that we can deal with today, not what we might do in 2040 to prepare for 2050.
Can I just add a couple? Oh, I'm sorry, Tom. Just a couple of comments on that. I mean, I share Mark's skepticism of the value of looking out to something like 2050. I'm generally pessimistic about the department's ability to really predict the future. Our track record is very poor, as more established and prominent people than me have said. But I think we don't even do that good of a job sort of projecting what I would call the more predictable future. I mean, when you look at Russia and China, for example, we should have been paying attention to what they were doing for the last 10 years. It was visible, we could see it, but we were still so focused on the Middle East and other things that we were just not paying attention. And I think even though I agree with Mark that all of the stakeholders are at the table or in the process, for a lot of different reasons, I think even the services and the joint staff have become overly focused on the present, driven by the combatant commanders. The whole system kind of gravitates towards feeding the demands of the combatant commanders. And the White House contributes to that, frankly, because the White House, whoever they are, lives in the present. So I think you need to have other structures to try to pull against that drag. And something like Bob Work's, third offset strategy work and all of the various initiatives that were spinning off of that was a way to try to do that. And I think, again, those kinds of projects are very valuable because you really need to pull the system towards thinking at least about what I would call the predictable future, if not the, truly unforeseeable.
Yeah, look, I think, and I agree with everything that's been said. I mean, it's an act of supreme strategic judgment and supreme political judgment to figure out where to invest the marginal dollar. I mean, we need to win the wars that we're in, but at the same time, we also need to place bets, and that's what they are. They're bets in terms of investing capabilities, broadly construed, against an uncertain future. Because it's absolutely true what former Secretary Rumsfeld said. You go to war with the army that you have, not the army you wish you had. In other words, you make bets in peacetime that maybe sometime in the future you find out whether those were good bets or not because of the way things turn out. And you can't put all eggs in one basket. You can't put all eggs in the other basket. I do think, though, that, and this picks up on some things Mark said, that the system is somewhat skewed to the near term. It is somewhat skewed to the operational. And it is, as I said earlier, somewhat skewed towards dealing with our vulnerabilities as opposed to exploiting opportunities. So there, I would think about how do you marginally right that balance?
Yeah, so right now, as it stands, the best process we have, or the process we have, gives you about an 18-month snapshot of how well we can perform against the things we plan for. The interesting thing I found, and we just wrote a piece actually, sort of presaging the report, but right now we assess risk on plans we basically don't execute, or against scenarios that are heavily biased by the services and what they want to see in those scenarios, right? And we focus excessively on the near term. What I find really interesting is all the service chiefs have recently talked about readiness as being their number one priority. What I think is really important, that may very well be true, but that means what it should mean is that readiness needs to be redefined, right? Readiness needs to be defined over that continuum and not fight tonight, as we kind of write in the report. Not the concept of fight tonight readiness, which is very important, and we can't sacrifice, in certain circumstances, we can't sacrifice that ability. How we took this on in the report is we talked about 10-year military demand. We said, right, you can't go out to 2050, you can't go out to 2030. What you can do is you have an environment, you have a set of objectives, you strain your objectives through your environment, not the other way around, because your objectives should remain relatively enduring. And from that, you understanding what your environment's going to present to you, you have a set of 10-year military demands. Those things we think that'll, in general terms, the department has to do to secure its objectives over a 10-year period. And then we look at those demands through the lens of importance, urgency, capability, capacity, and agility, our ability to actually flex over time to those. And I think that it does come down to some concept of readiness, but that readiness has to be redefined, again, in a way that sort of lets you look over time. In our case, we said 10-year demand, right? And lets you look at the implications at the different levels of analysis, military, strategic, and everything in between. But we really do need to get our heads, stuck out of what we would call the lower left-hand corner of the quadrant, right? Operational risk, military risk, near-term operational risk, basically. And if we don't do that, we will definitely miss things.
One last question for me, unless did you have something? Okay, great. So we've talked about how risk and the formulation of it exists in a very political and policy-oriented conversation. What advice would you give to the department going forward in terms of how to best communicate its risk assessment to the public, to allies and adversaries, to Congress?
Well, my first recommendation would be to communicate it, because the past QDRs have tended not to do that. Christine makes the good point that the 2014 QDR was very emphatic about communicating the risk of sequestration. But when you get beyond that, I'd say there's very little. So they should think about doing that consciously. And maybe building on what Christine said about the four kinds of risks, the categorization that had been there in '97. It was carried forward a couple of QDRs, although it's faded away.
So would suggest that there of course has to be a common currency. It has to be a common language that exists across, in the civilian and the military realm. And frankly, the throwaway line we have or concept we have is, once you really hit that currency, once at a senior level you agree that this is how we're going to talk about it, sort of what we recommend is an old trick I learned in OSD, actually, which is you start actually using that language in everything that you communicate outside of the department, right? So even before you have put out your QDR that puts your new risk construct out or whatever it is, every report to Congress uses that same language. Every internal report to each other talks about it in that same language, because that is how you actually begin to then socialize or normalize the conversation in a way that makes it consumable. And then the last thing I would say is make it consumable, right? Make it mean something. So we, at no place in the report that we wrote are the words sort of significant, high, moderate, low. None of that is in there, because it has, in the words of a relatively senior service official, the consumers and assessors of risk have become numb to that language, and it doesn't mean anything to them. And that's Congress, that's the department itself, that's the defense intelligentsia or chattering class. None of that means anything to anybody anymore. So you have to find a common currency that communicates what you need, in a way that's consumable.
Several things. I would say first, we need to stop being schizophrenic when it comes to talking about American military power. And when I say schizophrenic, I mean, on the one hand, let's stop with the platitudes that America has the finest armed forces in the world. Do we? In history, that's right. So it'd be us against the Spartans, I guess, and we'd beat the Spartans.
Yeah.
But I'm serious.
Yeah, I agree with that.
And that's, do we honestly know? Do we honestly know that we have the, let's just say today, let's 1939 Wehrmacht versus, 19, whatever, the Safavids or whatever, who would win? So let's stop that on the one hand, and on the other hand, the screaming and wailing, that if we have any cuts, everything will fall apart. Because I think the American people have right to question whether either of those is true. And I think we as an institution should certainly question whether either of those is true. So that's one. So, and we also need to speak very frankly and very clearly about the challenges that we face and the threats that we face. And I think one great opportunity, frankly, that this administration has, an administration marked by frank speech and blunt speech, is to actually talk and level with the American people about the nature of the strategic and operational challenges that we face. Because I think just platitudes aren't going to change the conversation. They shouldn't. And I think we need much more of a frank discussion of risk and what the consequences are of failing to deal with those risks.
It's a perfect segue, because I've actually I've made that exact point in other places, and I've also said that in addition, we have to be more honest about the outcome of that force and what they're trying to achieve in the political system in the United States, but geopolitically. So we also have to talk about the stalemate in Afghanistan. It's as described by the current commander, the very unsettling outcome, I don't know what it is, in Iraq, and the longevity of time and effort and treasure and blood and thinking. And to your point, we also need to talk about the outcomes and where we are with the state of the simmering conflicts as they've been for the last 15 years, honestly. But that gets to back to the political system. So the department has to recognize then, for some reasons that aren't its own fault, because sequestration was a real threat, and then it actually did happen in many ways. It was alleviated and helped a little bit, but it happened. So partly because of sequestration, which is not the Defense Department's fault, but they had to prepare and plan for it, prepare 2 budgets that year, almost 3 budgets, you could argue, leading up to it, had to warn of all of the dire consequences that confused members of Congress. Well, then something short of sequestration is okay. And then you get, 9-month CRs, you get no fiscal, predictability, you get top lines that are a fraction of what you had asked for them to be. It's all just a mess. But I think departmental leadership, civilian appointed, either administration, this current one, the few that there are, the last one, the one before it, but also the uniformed leadership needs to recognize that they lack credibility now on Capitol Hill. So you can't go in there and start talking about it and get anywhere with the members unless you recognize that you have a problem. So, and increasingly, the department's leadership is talking only to the group of people that wants to listen to them anyway. And if they think you have a credibility problem, then you really have a problem. Because, the people on the committees of jurisdiction for the department are, by their choice to sign up to that committee, want to hear from the department, and they generally tend to side with DOD when there is criticism thrown at the Hill. But defense leaders have a hard time talking to people outside of the committees, outside of the leadership of the committees, and outside of, just normal talking about anything with any member of Congress, or staff. So but there is a big credibility gap. I'm not saying I know how to get it back, but I know the readiness crisis, as the chiefs are describing it, is going to probably contribute to and exacerbate the gap. And of course, you have sequestration technically looming yet again, and so it's a hard thing to thread that needle of this is so bad, but then I heard it just this week actually, on Tuesday, from a stakeholder, policymaker in defense. Well, but they did have sequestration and the sky didn't fall, so aren't they all just like basically liars? And so that same thing it could happen now. Congress is inclined to pour more money into readiness than any other priority, but sequestration is still looming, so the things are still going to be, the news will still be bad. And so if I'm the politician who doesn't sit on a defense committee, doesn't think about this unless there's a bill on the floor, I'm thinking, we keep giving you guys money, it's never enough, the sky never falls, and then you don't have much to show for it when we give you all that extra money, so I got other things I got to deal with.
Christine, for time.
I would just say, Mackenzie knows a lot more about the Hill than I do, but the credibility gap kind of goes both ways, Congress is a big part of the problem, and so there's a huge amount of frustration in the department with the fact that you want us to make tough decisions, you want us to make reforms, we go up, we give you packages that we're getting killed, by our own people, our own troops are in our leaders' faces saying, how can you cut our benefits, how can you do all this? And Congress won't let us do it. They won't let us do what we need to do. So, it's even worse, I think, in that what you think, because it's like, the credibility gap is there on both sides, and I don't know how to fix it either. But I certainly felt frustrated by it.
Great. We're going to turn to the audience for question and answers. I'm going to bundle questions together since we have about 10 minutes left in this session. If you could please state your name and affiliation and stand up when you receive a microphone, that'd be great. Please raise your hand. Gentleman in the blue tie to start.
Good morning, Admiral Bill Truelove. I'm the Canadian Defense Attaché. Thanks for bringing us together. A great strategic conversation that certainly is not unique on this side of the border. This is a global conversation. And so I guess 2 points I'd be curious to hear maybe some thoughts on. One is, how do you take this discussion to the partner and alliance element? How do we manage risk at the alliance level? How do we be truthful within the alliance, to Tom's good point, of where we really are? And then the second point I'd be curious of thoughts on is, how much of this do we really control? I heard some comment of, about 91, we started to get away from talking about risk, but others didn't, and that would be mass media. So on a day-to-day basis, risk is being defined by the media, which is taking us to the tyranny of today. And so how do we deal with that in our risk management mitigation strategies? Thank you.
Great. And I'll take one more. Woman right here in the front.
Good morning. I'm Elizabeth Moore. I'm also with DOD. The gray zone conflict issue really raises a couple of interesting challenges in terms of risk assessment. One is that the line between war and peace is becoming very blurred. The other is the U.S. government generally is not great at dealing with issues that don't fit neatly into one basket. So I'm curious as to whether those at the upper reaches handling risk assessment are aware of these issues and taking them on board in their calculations.
Would someone like to start?
Yeah,
on
sure.
either of those? Yep.
Okay, so let me first talk about alliance risk very quickly. just again as a nod to the report, I mean, we think we're at a place now, the United States, based on the hyper-competitive environment that we find ourselves in with our allies and partners, that actually it's time for federated risk assessment, right? I mean, we have to actually start realistically sitting down with our closest partners, for example, Canada, and those partners we typically, consider, sort of our global partners, and so also in a regional context, our regional partners, and start having sort of real, frank, high-level discussions where we really do federate sort of our risk assessment in a way where we say, how are we going to actually make up for the gaps that we see, or opportunities, just frankly, that we see? Because we do think that that's important, and we highlighted that as one of the conclusions of the report, that we have to do that. Now, the second thing on the gray zone, so interestingly enough, we spent a lot of time talking about risk in the gray zone report that we did last year. And what we found was one of the key characteristics that when you know you're in a gray zone problem when there is risk confusion, and we call risk confusion the hazard associated with action and the hazard associated with inaction appear to be equally high and unpalatable, right? Which leads to sort of a paralysis or a level of inaction on the part of the target of the gray zone, assault campaign, et cetera. I think that, frankly, it will increasingly have to be part of our risk calculation, because what's happening in large measure with gray zone conflicts is that, and this is actually in the process of our gathering information for our report, what's happening is we are being operated against with one set of capabilities or methods, and we are being deterred with another set of capabilities and methods, i.e., so in Eastern Europe, you have little green men, political agitation, sort of, et cetera, and then over the horizon is the S-300 and the Smersh rockets and all that. So you're stuck in this dilemma. And so we have to, not only from a strategic level, do we have to find a better way to account for the gray zone and begin to sort of campaign back against it, but in the same vein, we actually have to be able to sort of handle this idea of assuming or taking more risk. We learned from one of our allied partners as we went out to the Pacific to talk about the risk report itself. You can't actually, you will not engender any risk unless you're actually taking some. And so I thought that was a very sage advice from one of our allies, actually, in the Pacific. So that's my response to the gray zone.
A couple more, unless Tom, did you want to jump in?
Just on the allied point, and I basically agree with Nate, but just to amplify, I mean, I think we do need, and I think we do, have very frank discussions with our allies. But I think each of us has some very difficult decisions to make. Mm-hmm. So one is, if we think about planning for future contingencies, we certainly can't presume that an ally would, in some hypothetical future situation, make a political decision to participate or to not participate, whatever the contingency is. And similarly, allies, have to make that calculation on their end as well. So there's uncertainty there. Then there's a second set of trade-offs too, which is there's always a desire, and it's certainly true in the United States, true certainly in Canada and with others, to possess sovereign capabilities, sovereign unilateral capabilities. But there also are great benefits for allied capabilities, for sharing and for interdependence. And again, that applies equally to the United States and to others. Information sharing is a great example where there's a real pull to do everything yourself, but we collectively, the United States and our allies, derive great benefit from sharing information. And so going forward, what is our comfort level? What's the comfort level in Washington, D.C.? What's the comfort level in Ottawa? with what absolutely has to be a sovereign capability and what can be an alliance capability. And those are very difficult political decisions. But I think we need to be having those discussions.
Great points. I'll take a couple more questions from the audience. Gentleman here in the front, and let's see, gentleman in the tie in the middle. Yes, thank you.
I'm Sandy Apgar, CSIS. What happens to strategy, both in definition and in analysis, when the battle space itself becomes largely robotic? Not entirely, but much more than 20 years ago, most people in this department would have envisioned. As a business strategist, that is the #1 strategic issue in most of the corporate clients that I work with, and I wonder if it should be or how much it would be here.
Great. Gentleman back here.
And Andrew Bookbinder, PILPG. Given the multitude of factors that are pushing policy towards the present term, what does an actual plan to kind of push risk assessment towards the near future or the mid-future look like, and how likely is something like that to happen?
Great.
Yep.
Anyway? Yep. Nate, you want to jump in?
Yeah, I'll jump in first on the near, mid, and long term. I think actually if the picture is presented near, mid, and long, it would be a huge step forward, right? So, I mean, if the risk picture is presented instead of the risk picture now being presented in sort of this near term, 0 to 18 month or 5 year, this is what our, we basically revisit every year what our known operational vulnerabilities and challenges are. That's what our risk assessment amounts to, frankly, in my mind. But if presented to policymakers and decision makers in snapshots over time or in views of risk over time, I think you will get more valuable outcomes. Frankly, to what Mark was talking about you will see choices more clearly that you need to either make now for the future or defer to the future. So that's what I would say on that. On the robotic issue, that is, I think, the $1 million question, right? Like, when we are actually beginning to think strongly about mass deployment of unmanned systems in lethal operations that against other unmanned systems, as well as against human targets, for lack of a better term, that complicates the risk question immensely. But what I would also say is what we're not probably doing, and someone just brought this up to me recently, what we're not probably doing is investing enough in our risk assessment where we can, quote, buy down risk, to use a term that Mark talked about, or I think actually it was Tom, buy down risk using more unmanned and robotic systems. So, I mean, I think I would make those 2 points.
I guess on the robotics issue, I'd say so 2 things. I mean, one is I think DoD has to, and the U.S. government has to deal with much more, although it still exists in the civilian world and the business world, but much more. We've got to deal with fact versus fiction, right? And I think that there's a whole fiction that's grown up over autonomous weapons, for example. Mm-hmm. That's just really at variance with reality or projected reality. I think James Cameron's a great filmmaker and I like Terminator, but it's also done a lot of damage and probably will continue to in all sorts of ways. So that's one. 2 is there is a hypothesis, and I think it often is stated as a postulate in DoD, but I do think it's a hypothesis. It's this hypothesis that man-machine, human-machine teaming will give the United States, if we exploit it, a comparative advantage. I don't know that that's true. I don't know that it's untrue, by the way, right. But I don't know that it's true. In other words, I don't know that teaming American soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines with machines in various innovative ways will give us an edge over, randomly, Russian soldier, sailor, airman, Marine. I don't know. Maybe. Maybe it would actually give the other guys an advantage. Don't know. I think it's a hypothesis worth exploring and worth exploring in depth, but I wouldn't put my money on that right now. So.
Well, I want to thank all of you for joining us today for a great discussion on risk in the 21st century, and please join me in thanking our terrific panel.